Okay, so this is the old wall we're working with. We've got an old wall here, we've got half of the top which is render, which is existing, which is solid and it can't come off. And we've got the bottom which is brick, but it's got some old paint that's been applied and obviously peeling back. So we've got to hack that back first. We've got his grinder, we've grinded all the old paint back, and now we're going to put a pre-grit in. This is an exterior pre-grit, and what this is going to do is kill the suction on the brickwork and enable us to put a new layer of render on top. Now this is the same situation, this is just a different pre-grit, that's where the red is. And what we're going to do now is not only render the walls, but we're going to back it with mesh. And this is just going to give us the strength needed. So if there is any movement in the brickwork, or if there's any movement in the building, then at least this is going to bind it together and obviously hold it back from any cracks reappearing in the future. Now everything on this wall is solid. There is a crack that was shown at the top. That is also solid. What we've got to do though is make sure that the cracks don't reappear, which is why we're using this mesh. You can also use EML, but this is just a lightweight version. And when you've got a stable background, it's just going to bind your wall and your product together. So we've got the render. This is a mixed pre-bag render. It's called OCR, Webber OCR. It's the render that my render of choice at the moment. I'm really enjoying using it. And the good thing about this premixed rendering system is you don't have to worry about the sand ratios, you don't have to worry about getting your mixes right. It's all bagged up, ready to go. All you've got to do is mix it and then apply it to the walls. So what we're going to do at this first stage is apply a nice thin coat of render. We want it to be thin. We don't want this thick layer, because what we've got to do is embed the mesh into it. So we're going to apply a nice coat, even coverage throughout, and we're not going to worry about getting it flat. We're just going to fill in all the gaps in the old brickwork. Again, this isn't red paint, this is a primer. It's just different to the one I shown at the beginning of the video. And this is, again, it's just going to bind the material to the brickwork. This also had old paint on it. We've had to scabble that back with the grinder. And now we're just going to apply a thin coat as we stated before. And any gaps in the brickwork, any gaps in the mortar lines, we're just going to fill in with the render now, applying a tight application. You've got first person view, and then this is the render mesh we cut before. And what you want to do is, either if you're working left to right, you always want a 100mm overlap, whichever way you're playing it. So that line I scored was just a rough guide on where I want it to be applied. So starting from the left, what you want to do is with your trowel push all the pressure through from the render, and what that's going to do is, whilst you're troweling, it's going to bring that render through to the mesh, and it's just going to make sure that it's all going to be embedded tightly. This is why we don't want a thick coat. We want a nice thin coat of render, and that's going to allow the render to shine through and pick up through the meshwork there. Basically what we're doing today's video is going to show you a full example on how to turn old grubby walls into works of art. Now what they want to do is keep this brickwork, they want to make a feature out of it. I'm going to walk you through that in today's video, because as you can see, the bricks look grubby, they don't look very nice. So my big challenge was, how am I going to make this wall look decent whilst trying to keep the old features in mind? Now that is today's challenge, that's what we're going to go into, and that's what I'm going to show you later on in this video. But first off, like I said, we want to make sure I've got the mesh running throughout the whole of the wall. So again, this is all just pre-mixed. The good thing about OCR render, this bagged render, is if it dries out, just give it a little whisk with your mixer, it's good to go again. So throughout the day, you've always got the availability to leave it, and you know that you can come back and it's not going to be too thick to start running up again. Now that first coat with the mesh was very tight, so what I want to do is add a little backup coat. So I'm adding another layer on top, and this is just going to complete the scratch coat. Because we put such a thin layer on and we've scraped it through the mesh again, we do need to bring it up. Now the corner beads I've got bedded on, they're 15mm. I always like to render to 15mm. I think it's a nice thickness. I find that 12 can be a little bit too thin, and 20mm is definitely too thick. So for me, 15mm beads is a perfect little middle ground. You know you're going to get a decent thickness, and you also know that overall you've got a nice background. It's going to have a lot of strength to it without too much weight, where it's going to pull itself back off the wall there. And what I always do with my scratch is I always rule it back. So I've applied my first coat, bedded the mesh, and now I'm just ruling back my second layer. And this is still, in a sense, still the scratch coat, even though it's 2 parts to it, and it is a bit more long-winded. I allow more time when I'm embedding mesh into the brickwork because it does take more time. And to be honest, on another note, I do charge more money because in terms of materials it's more, but it's just the labour intensity of applying mesh into brickwork. It does take more time and is a lot more time consuming. So I've applied the layer. With my scratch coat I always rule it flat, sorry. So I've used a rule, but I also like to use my trowel on little areas like this. There's no reason you shouldn't be treating your trowel as a straight edge, and don't be scared to do it, especially when you've got jagged brickwork like that, what obstacles work around. It's always nice to use your trowel held 90-degree angle. You know that's a straight edge in itself, so there's no reason you shouldn't be using it. So again, don't be too pedantic with this stage, but I do like to flatten my scratch. Again, we're just going to follow through under the window here and make sure that that whole area is covered with a decent coat. So an overall thickness of your scratch coat, even if you're not putting the mesh in, we're looking at about 8-9 mil. I don't like the top coat to be too thick when I'm finishing. We're going to go into that in today's video, but I like my depth to be in the scratch. Like I said, I don't like my top coat to be too thick. I find it can sag, and when you're on the finishing stages of rendering, you don't want your render to be sagging or creating any problems that aren't already there. So again, just following through the rule, making sure we're getting the area nice and flat, and that's just going to ensure that when it comes to applying your top coat render, we've got an even flat background to work on, and then when it all dries out, it's all going to dry at the same time, which means we're going to finish it at the same time. Again, to some people this might seem pedantic, and yeah, it probably is. But I am filling in my low spots in the scratch coat. I just like to make sure it's dead flat. It's probably a bit of my OCD, and it is probably a bit too far, but I am just going to ensure that this surface is flat to work on, and make sure that when I am render, that top coat's going to have a nice flat background to work on. And if I ensure that anyone is a beginner that you also rule your scratch, it just gives you that experience to get you used to using a rule, and also the experience of knowing that your top coat is going to be nicer to work with. Again, nothing complicated here, but we're going to scratch it once we've had a little bit of time to dry. I like the render to take up before you scratch. If you do it too soon, you've got the fear of it pulling back from the brickwork because you've disturbed it too early. So I have given it a bit of time before I've done this. I've got a stop bead at the bottom of this wall as well, and that's going to stop any water rising through the render. So we have got a decent stop bead with a brick thickness, and that's again going to stop any water rising through. Now here's a complicated bit. Remember the bricks that we had before? What I've got is some brick cleaner. Now this is very strong stuff, and you should wear gloves. I didn't because I'm stupid, but you should wear gloves because this is strong stuff. What you want to do is I've applied one coat of it, and then within 3 minutes give it a good scrape, get back any of that old mortar back from the brickwork. It is very strong stuff, and this stuff, it's cemento and it's very good actually. But then I got a wire brush. What I'm trying to do is clean that old grubby bricks, bring them back, because like I said, we are going to make a feature out of them. It's the customer's choice. I just didn't want the bricks to look as bad as it did, so I've gone out of my way to try and spruce them up a little bit. It's because if there's nothing worse, you've got new render and you've got the brickwork, it's just going to let it down. So I've repeated this process about 3-4 times. So you apply the brick acid, scrape it back, and hose it down, and then I repeated this another 2 times just to make sure that the bricks are really starting to shine. And I must admit, they come through really good. So if you ever were unsure about how the product worked, I thought it worked amazingly. And as you can see, you know, they've really come up to what they were before. The old mortar's really come back, and it just shows that old pointing as well. And yeah, it's gone really well actually. I was very surprised how well it went. So what I wanted to do is make a feature out of it. We've obviously got a lot of plastic on the window, so instead of trying to cut it back and freehand in the render, I thought I'd use a nice, this is I think a 3mm render bead, very thin. So we're just adding it to the scratch coat, and that way when you look, it's almost showcasing the brickwork. So you've got the rough, obviously the rough old features of the bricks showcased in a nice beading. That's how I thought I'd get around it. And what we're going to do now is top coat. So mixed up, again, a new batch of render. Everything's dried up a little bit. The good thing about this bag render, which is OCR, you can do it all the same day. So you don't have to wait in between like traditional sand cement. You can literally apply your render, get it all done the same day, and it's actually designed to be pumped, sprayed on. That's why it's called one coat render, because you can spray it on at 20 millimeters. I find that when you're applying it, it does sag if you're doing it that thick. So I like to do it in different layers, and especially when you're applying your mesh, you won't be able to do it all in one go like that. So we're just applying the render, like I said, another layer on top. What we're going to do is build it out to the beads. This is going to be the end thickness, and this is going to be the overall thickness of the rendered wall. Again, we've got quite a few backgrounds to work. We've got the existing stone effect to the left, we've got the beads, and it's not a nice area to work with in terms of size. So I've used my rule, it's just my 1.2 Derby. But again, make use of the trowel you've got. I'm working around the edges with it. I've got it at a 90-degree angle, and make sure that when I'm using it as a rule, we're holding it firm, but there's no reason you shouldn't be using little edges like this. I also do have little straight edges, but I do sometimes just like using my trowel. So what I've done is following the bead there, making sure that we're perpendicular to the wall, parallel, and we've got to make sure that everything's square. So I use the main rule to give me the guide of where we're working to, and then from there we can get the thickness desired to start reeling it flat. Again, following through under the window, nothing you haven't seen here, but the one thing I will say about when applying renders, you want to be applying a lot of pressure, especially into the scratch coat. You want to be pushing hard into them grooves and making sure that you've got a nice tight bond. That's a great thing about using a pre-grit as well, which is showing you at the beginning of the video. You know that you're backed, you've got a nice grip to the brickwork, and there's no fear of it pulling itself back. It's the same when you're applying your top coat to the scratch coat. You're applying a lot of pressure, and you just want to make sure that you've got a nice bond between the two coats. If you're not applying the pressure, and if you're not reeling it flat like this, then it's not going to be pushed into the background, and you're not going to have a strong bond where if you didn't do that, it might lead to problems, might lead to cracks, and it might delaminate itself from the scratch. So that's why we apply the scratch coat, to make sure the top coat's got a nice firm fixing to itself. What we're doing is I've ruled it now, and I'm just filling in any low spots. So any low spots I've left behind, we're filling. Now for the top coat, this is where you've got to be pedantic. Everything's got to be filled, everything's got to be flattened, and everything has got to be nice, square and plumb. And that's because after this, we're coming to the floating, and that's when all the finish is done with. So we're ruling it off now, and you want to get it as flat as possible. I'm going to show you techniques on how to get it flatter even after this, but if you look at that, you can tell it's a straight bit of wall. Again, using the trowel to follow through to make sure that we're getting all them lines and the excess render nice and crisp. It was quite hard working around the stonework, and if anyone's done it before, it's quite tricky because you've got to really try and clean the edges off and make sure that that render doesn't stick to the stone effect on that side of the house. So I had to work quite hard brushing it back, keeping it clean. And again, ruling vertically as well as horizontally is crucial. So just coming to the top effect here, working to the bricks. Now what I wouldn't want to do is get all my nice fresh render all over my nice clean bricks. So I'm really taking my time, but the good thing is we've got that bead, it's prouder than the brickwork. So what I can do is just render into it without the fear that I'm going to get render all over the bricks. If it wasn't the case, I'd probably have them covered, but knowing what I do and knowing that the thickness is quite proud, you just have to take your time. Because again, they really wanted to make a feature out of the old existing brickwork. They didn't want it to look like a new build, and which I get. Well, actually, when it's finished, it ends up looking quite good, so we'll get to that at the end. But using the edge of my trowel, running along the bead, using the bead as a guide, because I know the bead's nice and flat. But we still, again, want to be using a straight edge to make sure that the length is flat all the way through. You don't want to just rely on trowels. This is 1.8 meter straight edge, and it's going to give us a real rule of thumb on how flat the wall is, and give us a real gauge on how we're doing in terms of thicknesses and flatness. So again, ruling vertically, making sure that it's flat everywhere, ready for the next stage, which is the final stage of finishing. Now, this in itself This is quite a skill, but this is a hand machine float. This is the power float. It's by Urban Stock, which is also, you know, owned by Rafina. Or they sell the tools, whichever way around it is. Even for a small area like this, I do still love using the power float. It's just a game changer. It really takes the hard work out of hand floating. I will show you what hand floating is involved like later on, but even for a small area like this, I'll always use my power float. I just love it. It's good. It's fast, and you can get on the render a lot earlier. This is what I like. Even if your render is still a bit wet, the power float will get over it because the disc has got a much bigger surface area. It just glides over the render, and it really does fill in the pockets. If anything, if anyone hasn't used a power float before, I prefer using it when it is slightly wetter to what you were as if you were hand floating. So as a rule of thumb, there you go. Again, any low spots now in the render, we want to be filling using the same gear that we mixed up before. We don't want it wet. We want the render to be quite stiff, so when it comes to the floating, it's not going to bubble up, it's not going to get too creamy and bring it back to life. So when you are refilling any low spots in the render after floating, you want it to be quite thick, and that's just going to ensure that it's not going to be too wet, it's not going to fall out, and then when you float it into itself, it's going to have a nice solid consistency. Now, this is the final stage. This is the sponging. This is I think it's called Hydro Sponge by Rafina. Again, just a brilliant bit of kit. Yeah, I've had this for months now, and it lasts forever. I used to just use the standard, bog standard car sponges, but these just go on and on. They just live forever, man. I can't seem to kill it off. So I'll be buying a lot of these, getting a lot of these in the bags. What I do, give it one initial sponge, and then I go over to give it the final sponge, where we're giving it that traditional closed-in sand cement finished. And what we're doing here is it's bringing the aggregate of the sand to the surface. It's giving it that traditional look. Again, it was quite particular. I wanted it to look crisp, especially compared to the old brickwork. But for anyone who hasn't done any rendering, these hand sponges are brilliant. Now this is a hand float. This is the other option to using the power float, which I've shown you before. But what I've got, if you've got any low spots, even after sponging, it's never too late to just use a bit of old gear and then sponge it into itself. It's never too late to fill in any low spots, and I really do applaud you to take time and make sure that if there's any low spots, you're getting filled in. And cleaning your edges where you're going into existing walls, that's very important. And making sure that when you work into your beads, very crisp, you're making sure that it's all looking good, because at the end of the day, it's the edges and your corners where people are going to pay the most attention, and there's where you're going to have the most amount of scrutiny. You might have a bit in the middle and get away with that, but you'll never get away with bad looking edges. So as a plasterer, as a renderer, take your time and make sure that your edges, your corner work is always the best. And then this is the final bit. Now, as a rule of thumb, the top was still quite wet, I must admit. And as you can see, when you float, when the render is quite wet, it can kind of pull away for itself. But you just got to kind of persevere, because we've wrapped all the way around now. I've come to the top. This is the final section. So, good rule of thumb, don't get the render any wetter than what it is, and just take your time, and that way you will eventually make sure that you get it nice and flat with the float. And now what we're doing is filling the beads in, filling in the gaps towards the beads, and I'm also making sure that I'm cleaning the bead off, cleaning the brickwork, make sure none of that render is sticking to it. And then, like I said before, give it a nice little sponge, and there it is. So the old battered wall that was left before is looking like this, and we've made a real feature out of the brickwork, and I'm actually, despite my delegations, I'm quite happy how it turns out. Now, if you want to see a full video on the Webber OCR, which is the render I was talking about in this, which in my mind is a game changer in terms of rendering solutions, and just click this video on the left, and I'll show you the full process, how to use it, and I'll show you a better way to render walls using this product. Cheers.